covering controversy in college sports. Next on a special edition of Carpe Diem. Hello, welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Mark Rosenwig, Assistant Professor of Broadcasting at Montclair State University. Top college athletic programs are big businesses that draw major coverage from sports reporters. During a panel discussion at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center on the Montclair State campus, I was joined by three journalists who've covered the college sports beat: Tom Rinaldi of ESPN, Aditi Kikimwala of the Wall Street Journal, and Steve Politi of the Star-Ledger. For all three, the sexual abuse scandal involving the football program at Penn State was a challenge to cover, especially for Rinaldi, who reported extensively from that campus.
I would say, without exception, it was the most challenging story that I've ever covered. I learned a lot. I don't know that I'm a fundamentally strong reporter, and the dynamics of that story would challenge the strongest reporting fundamentals of anyone, any of these guys, any of our peers. Here's one simple example of that. 2 days after I arrived, I got a phone call from somebody who said he was a state police investigator involved with the case. He was growing more and more agitated on the phone with the media coverage of Mike McQueary, feeling as though Mike McQueary, for anybody who doesn't remember, was the graduate assistant at the time, who's since elevated to an assistant coach, now on administrative leave, who allegedly witnessed the incident with the 10-year-old child and Jerry Sandusky in a shower at Penn State University. He couldn't believe the media portrayal in his mind of McQueary, and this is how he phrased it to me. I am so sick and tired of all the people you have on your air, analysts more than reporters, most likely, columnists across the country too, who know exactly what they would have done in that instance. They all would have rushed in, taken the child, decked the coach, and been a hero. I can't take their judgment anymore. Maybe you don't know what you would have done. Here's what I know. 7 years later, I came back to this guy about a moment which wasn't the proudest in his life, and I asked him what happened. The easiest thing for him to have said was, "I don't remember." But he didn't. He said exactly what he remembered, even though he knew, not to the degree that and the scale that the story blew up into, but he knew that it was at peril to his career. Yet he told the truth and he never wavered. He was angry with me and with the media in general. And then, at the end of the phone call, he said to me, remember, this is 2 days after the story really takes off, prior to Paterno being fired. And Jerry Sandusky was at Beaver Stadium at that last home game with a child. As these guys will tell you, that's a powerful piece of information. Do you go with that? Do you try to corroborate that? Is this guy who he says he is? He won't meet me in person. He'll give me a phone number. Ultimately, I sat on that piece of information week after week, unable to corroborate it. And it wasn't until December that we ultimately reported that he was not only at Penn State for the final home game that Joe Paterno coached, but that he had a child with him. Those were some of the complexities involved with reporting that story, from the beginning all the way through the memorial that was public in nature for Joe Paterno.
Steve, what's your view of the coverage? And you've written about it and written about Paterno's reaction in the interview with Paterno before he died, etc.
And I'm sure in hindsight you're very glad you did wait and to make sure you had it right, because it was a situation where there's so much information out there. So much of it turned out to not be true. So much of it we still don't know what's true.
Exactly.
For me, the biggest challenge was, as a columnist, our job is to form opinions on something that, in this case, we ultimately couldn't know. And it was very hard to make sure that you were writing something that was both, I want to tell you what my take on this is. And of course, everybody felt the charges were vile and disgusting and how could this happen? And there was a lot of outrage about it. But at the same time, you had to be measured, and you couldn't jump to a conclusion of something you didn't know ultimately. And that was the hardest thing about writing columns. And what I tried to do when I was working on it, and I wrote a column a couple of days after where I went out and I interviewed. What struck me about it was that because the Penn State's inaction during that first, they waited this long, that no one knew who the victim in that shower was. That they had not identified him in the grand jury report.
And publicly, he's still not known.
Still not known. And to me, that was such a powerful thing that we're talking about Paterno and his legacy, we're talking about Sandusky and Penn State, what's going to happen to the campus, the athletics, but ultimately we don't know who that boy is. And it just struck me to such a degree, and I talked to a couple of victims of child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church who, I wanted to know what was that boy going through. And one of them told me, we don't know if he's alive. They're very blunt about it. These things affect young people at such a level that we don't know. We don't know what happened to this kid now, where he is, if he's living, if he's an alcoholic, the problems he's run into. I just did my best to try to paint, a picture of what that meant to this. But again, the hard part was making sure what you were writing was accurate and you weren't jumping to a conclusion that you couldn't know, and still a lot of ways don't know.
And let me just very quickly say, to the way anyone who reads Steve and reads his columns, and I think there's a word in the middle of that answer, and it's a really important word, and that word is measured. I mean, Steve is paid to have opinions, and sometimes, especially with such an emotional topic, maybe the greatest taboo in our entire society, to be measured takes some valor, and was very uncommon in the initial wake of what happened.
Didi, let me ask you, with so many bloggers, so many analysts, and so on today, is this a problem that too many people will be expressing opinions about delicate issues like this without having all the facts available to them?
I don't know that it's a problem, but we all do pick up something. You hear something and everyone runs with it, and I don't think that we corroborate facts. I was literally stunned when you said you had that piece of information and you sat on it. And when does anyone ever do that anymore? And at the Journal, that was one of the hardest things I had to learn. There is this long tradition of everything must be fact-checked 4 times over and vetted by the lawyers, and there's things that I've gotten that I've known to the core of my body that I can't run with because I don't have a third person saying that this is true. And that's given me this greater appreciation for that. And literally, I'm stunned that you sat on that.
Unfortunately, other people don't do this.
Exactly, and it gives me so much
there.
hope that there's still that. And I mean, right now, in this day and age, in fact, I did a story with Steve Lavin, who's a St. John's men's basketball coach, has been in the public eye, has been a broadcaster, is so free and open. And the story I did when he first came to St. John's was, is this personality going to work as a basketball coach, as a public figure, when you're going to walk your dog, and that might be a blogger there. You're sitting in a restaurant, that might be somebody who's sending something to Deadspin.
They're tweeting about what we're saying right now.
Exactly, and can you be so open? And in fact, I had a conversation with Tom Izzo at Michigan State, who said that he won't have a drink in public anymore because a few years ago he had one glass of wine with his wife out at a restaurant, and the next morning it was all over Sports Talk Radio that Coach Izzo was wasted at this restaurant. And so it's like, as you said, there's so much information out there now. There's not any standards in place to know if that information is accurate. You just have to be so careful now. And it's our responsibility in some ways to hold ourselves to that different standard.
Is there an issue, whether it's the Penn State story or any other story, that editors will pressure reporters to be first, and they're more likely to succumb to that pressure and not stand up and say, wait, we can't go with this, when the editor's over their shoulder?
That's a great question. And I think for anyone who's listening here, for all of us, ego is one of the undeniable forces in life.
It's more than another.
Everybody has an ego. Everybody wants to feel that they got credit for something. At ESPN, without question, one engine of ego, as small as it might seem, is the bottom line. Did I get something out there so that my name or somebody else's name is going to crawl across that bottom line for an hour? According to Steve Politi, X. And sometimes, and I'm sure I've fallen prey to it at times as much as anybody, that drives you. And I go back to it. Aditi said that if you don't check yourself, if you're not measured, as Steve said, it typically drives you to a bad place.
Especially now, when and everything's out there so quickly. I mean,
Right.
early in my career, breaking a story meant, you got it, and you sat there, and you woke up the next morning, you ran out, it was in the newspaper, and this is, it's like I'm like, dinosaur coming. But really, it was in the newspaper, and you had it for a day, and you owned it, and you saw your competition there, and you're like, you didn't, and now you put it on Twitter, and the moment you find out about it, it's out there. There's, if you're wrong, you're wrong. You're wrong.
And what is the ultimate? What's the ultimate sin that you could commit in what we do? And that would be to get something wrong that you just can't get wrong.
Yes.
And that would be to declare somebody dead who is in fact alive. That happened in the Joe Paterno coverage the night before he died. And a very, very small website run by students put out the fact that he had died, and moments later, it was part of CBS Sportsline. Just a true cautionary tale about rushing to be first rather than rushing to be right.
And we should tell everybody that the CBS editor was fired, as well as the resignation of the student from the website as well. And this also brings us to the question of who's really covering and breaking these stories. For example, in the Penn State story, the story was broken basically by a reporter at the Harrisburg Patriot News who was covering grand jury and had sources. She's 24 years old. She's an alum of Penn State. Barry Bonds' steroid story broken by investigative reporters at the San Francisco Chronicle. Does this mean that we don't have enough sports reporters who are probing and investigating what's going on? Aditi, what's your view?
We're actually at the Journal. Our national NFL writer bled into investigative reporting. He was just hired to cover white-collar crime. And we have never had a dedicated investigative reporter. And my sports editor said he's looking to hire one right now because it is so important, as you say. That shouldn't necessarily be left. There are nuances to sports investigation that a cop's writer or that a courts writer may not necessarily get. And I think you do need that. I mean, this is such a big part of society. How can we not police? I hate to use the word police, is that right? But how can we not sort of censure? It's not only heroes and home runs. There's more to it. I do think we have to cover that.
I think the majority of the major stories that are breaking are still generated by Sports Journal. If you look at what Yahoo's doing with Charles Robinson and Dan Wetzel and the way they've investigated colleges, it's funny. I always think on a local level, and we just had this amazing story about a high school coach, a sainted high school coach, in his final season had been paid for the rent of these two star players and put them in this apartment, and then at the end of the game, they won the championship, kicked them out of the apartment. It's just stuff like that that's an incredible local story, a tale of, that translates beyond New Jersey. I think there's a lot of that going on out there, probably more than we know and more than we see.
But that's because we have to be plugged in. How does someone know? You cover that high school team. You sort of think, hey, it's a little unusual. There are these foreign students here. That's where you need the sports reporter, at least recognizing news. One of the biggest things is, can you recognize news? Do you know what news is? And you're talking about bloggers, or are you just getting wrapped up? It's like herd journalism. Are you just following the pack? Or are you saying, there's a story in that corner over there?
What about, though, when it comes to covering these colleges, because that's our main focus today, are there too many reporters who are too cozy with coaches, athletic directors, and so on, and does that inhibit the quality of the coverage? I mean, there have been a lot of questions about Syracuse with the Bernie Fine scandal, and but the police chief was a former player, and all these other. There are many elements to that story. But Tom, what's your view about relationships with coaches and players and ADs and so on?
Well, how complicated is that? Because you have the intersection of commerce and journalism, the ultimate clash between church and state, if you will. So here we are, we're paying rights to leagues on one side of our business model, a very important side, and then we're saying, completely separate from the financial deal that we have struck with you, we're going to have this arm of the company cover you without any attention paid to that deal. It's very, very complicated. But I think there's also a simpler complication to it in human dynamics. These guys know about it maybe even more than I do. If someone were to be critical of you, I mean critical, and say you did a poor job, it takes courage the very next day to stand in front of that person and then ask him or her a question the next day too. And there's a very complicated dynamic there, as I'm sure these guys can talk to, about criticizing a coach and then having to continue to cover him. And is he able or is she able to understand you're just doing your job, or you're writing what you believe to be the truth, or you're sharing your opinion, or is it going to be a personal vendetta now, which makes it more difficult to get the access that you want? Because to tell any story, you need some degree of access. And we typically don't govern that. It's governed by the programs we cover.
You mentioned the Bernie Fine story, which I think is another example of a great restraint. The Syracuse Post-Standard had investigated those charges for
I think both the
months.
Post-Standard and ESPN had recordings of Fine's wife speaking to one of the accusers
did not
for 8 years,
for 8
right?
years, exactly.
Yeah,
and did not report that until the second accuser. And now I think that in a lot of ways that story, we're seeing that a lot of that stuff that came out in the immediate aftermath, people are recanting their stories now, and that's falling apart. So.
But something like the Bernie Fine story, you sat on something for a couple of weeks until you got it right. 8 years, that's a long time, and somebody might say in a critical stance what Bernie Fine might or might not have done during those 8 years to other people and so on, and also the question of at what point as reporters are we obligated to go to law enforcement with information? That's a thing where I think we're all reluctant to do very quickly. But what should the guidelines be? Do you think?
Isn't that our justice system? Innocent until proven guilty. Don't they say better to let a guilty man go free than execute an innocent man? Mm-hmm. So I think that due diligence, yes, it's awful. It mortifies me how many children Jerry Sandusky had access to if he is indeed guilty of these acts. Mm-hmm. It's terrible, but I think it's more important to be right than to be first. And you're right, it's a fine dance. I mean, as you're sitting on that, what happens if somebody else gets that piece of information?
Right.
And that's really scary. But imagine if you had reported that and it had been wrong. I mean, that could be your career right there. So I don't know that there's an answer. I think it's, as you said, it's being measured. It's not getting too high. It's not getting too low.
Now, Tom, you did an interview with Jay Paterno. And tell us first, I have two questions about it, but first, how do you develop relationships with sources? What are some of the techniques we should know about? And how do you approach somebody who's in a difficult situation like he is and his family?
My wife a while back said a great thing to me. I was conflicted about covering a story where it was an ugly story, and I had some rapport with a subject of the story. And what my wife said to me was so simple, and I kept missing it. And what she said is, being a human being and being a reporter do not have to be at odds with one another. They don't clash with one another. They inform each other. And as obvious as that sounds, and as foolish as I was to not recognize that one piece of advice has really helped me. And that's in my role, which is different than Steve's. It's not to cast judgment. It's not to cast opinion. It's to try to report. But I just think, how would I want to be treated? And yet, what is fair? as we were talking about with Governor Christie and asking him some of those questions about his weight, what's fair? What seems appropriate and what's
Should we
fair?
poll the delegation here on Governor Christie? No, we're not. No, we're talking about.
But one of the things to say, for example, to ask Jay Paterno, does it put him in a difficult spot? Yes, but to say to him, if you saw Jerry Sandusky today, what would you say to him? He's maintained his innocence. What do you think? How do you think your father was judged in the court of public opinion? Why do you think your father was fired? Why? Those are fair questions. They're hard, but they're fair.
Well, I think there's also a good lesson for all of us in part of his response to being prejudged as well, because I believe Jay Paterno cited the Duke lacrosse case where there was a rush to judgment by some reporters and a rogue prosecutor, and also the Richard Jewell Olympic bombing case where his reputation was ruined forever.
You really paid attention to that interview.
I did. But, and this is something we talk about in ethics class here as well. But what about that? What about you're dealing with a prosecutor, you're dealing with the NCAA or whatever, they're saying one thing, they're the voice of authority. How do you sort that out when somebody's being prejudged? They haven't been, as you said, they haven't been convicted of anything, right?
Right. The Duke lacrosse thing was, I think, a little trickier than this one in that, not only were these charges brought, but the season was suspended, and a lot of things happened there that went beyond what we knew. Well, I mean, I think you could make a pretty good case on Paterno, and I did in my column, that he did not do enough just based on what you read. Here is the grand jury testimony. Here is 22 pages of what you're seeing here. Here's what Paterno knows and what he said, and you read the story there. I think most people, and a lot of people, came to the conclusion he just did not do enough, and did not do enough as the person who runs that program and is the head of the university in a lot of ways, even though he doesn't have that title. I think that was the opinion I wrote, that he shouldn't coach anymore. And I don't think it was. I know, but I've seen same interview with Jay Paterno. I don't think it was the rush to judgment that it was in Duke lacrosse. I just whether he was culpable in a legal sense, in my viewpoint, morally, especially when you saw the last interview with him with Sally Jenkins, I thought it was clear to me that he didn't live up to his moral obligation.
Didi, what's your view of that? I assume that most of you saw the Washington Post interview with him. I guess it was posted online. It was his last interview and so on. When you look at that as reporters, do you sit there and say, gee, I wish I could have been there and asked that question or whatever?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, how many unanswered questions do we still have about this whole story at this point, do you think, in Penn State?
Well, I think we still don't know all the facts. We still don't know if this man is guilty. We don't know who that 10-year-old is. We don't know how many other kids I think there are still a ton of questions out there. And was there some sort of institutional, again, I hate to use the word cover-up, but what was created, what was the environment created that Mike McQueary could, as your state trooper said, 7 years later, still have this angst? Why was it not clear? Why was there not some sort of self-policing mechanism that we place trust in our professors and our university leaders in some way to know what is right, what is morally right, what's not? How, as awful as it was, how could this kid be conflicted, or how could this assistant coach be conflicted? Was there something institutionally set up that, and I hate to lob charges, I'm telling you, we have to be so careful in what we say, but there's something in my head right now about what that whole organization, what that whole program was like, what the hold on the university that program had, that this was allowed to happen for the years it did.
It's a culture?
I do think that it's a culture.
Tom
would know better than I do.
I mean, we were scheduled to do the first TV interview, maybe the only TV interview that Joe was going to do.
By we, were you the one?
Yeah, I was supposed to do it. Barbara Walters was supposed to do it for ABC, and I was supposed to do it for ESPN. And it was always understood that Sally would do a print interview. On the second day of Sally's print interview, Joe went into the hospital, and of course he never came out. So the interview never happened. But I know one question that I wanted to ask Joe was, You have 17 grandchildren. God forbid that one of them was in the shower, alleged to have been treated that way. What would you have wanted to be done? And I don't know his answer.
Well, hopefully he wouldn't have said what he said about, I don't understand this
Yeah,
man-boy thing or whatever. I'm paraphrasing, obviously,
Yeah.
but that was
I don't
disturbing to hear.
understand man rape.
Yeah. I mean, that was, and maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know. As you say, we'll never know a lot of these answers. And isn't that really the problem with this story? That even though it's an ongoing story, we're going to have all this court action, all these hearings, possibly a trial, that we're never going to know all the answers.
And the biggest answer that we're not going to know is to echo Steve and the piece that Steve wrote in the early developments of the story. That we're really never going to know the repercussions and the shape of the lives of the children if the allegations are true. What happened to the souls of those children and what they carry with them now? Even if they were to testify, even if they were to appear in court. That's why the word I used over and over when I was covering this, when I did live shots, when I wrote pieces, was sadness. It's just an incredibly sad story, everywhere you look, in every direction. And I realize that some people think that's way too soft a word, that rage should be, and anger and vengeance and justice and those things. But to me, at core, it's just an incredibly, incredibly sad story.
The impact of the Penn State story is still being felt and is likely to continue long-term as court action moves forward. Special thanks to Barrow Museum Director Dave Kaplan for making our panel possible. For more information on this or any edition of Carpe Diem, contact us at carpediem@mail.montclair.edu or call 973-655-5158. I'm Mark Rosenwig for all of us at Montclair State University. Thanks for watching Carpe Diem.